I was sitting in my small office at Peterson Space Force Base, finishing paperwork after a morning flight briefing. The heater was humming, the coffee in my mug had gone cold, and I was trying to ignore the fact that I still had 2 hours left before I could head home. My phone buzzed on the desk. I almost ignored it, figuring it was some base-wide notification. But the sender's name made me look twice. Rebecca. It wasn't unusual for my sister to text me. What was unusual was that she'd emailed instead. Rebecca treats email like an ancient artifact. She only uses it when she wants to send something formal. That should have been my first warning sign. The subject line was blank. The message was short, 20-something words, tops. We want a quiet Christmas this year, just with the immediate family. Please don't take it personally. Don't come. That was it. No hello, no how are you, not even a fake smiley face at the end. Just a firm, don't come, softened with a please, like that made it polite. I read it again, thinking maybe my eyes were tired from staring at a screen all day. Same words, same polite, but final tone. The kind of tone that sounds calm but actually means, I've made up my mind and you don't get a say. For a few seconds I didn't move. The space heater hummed. A plane roared in the distance. I just stared at the screen, trying to process the fact that my own sister had sent me what was basically an uninvite to Christmas. I could have called her right then, but I knew how that would go. Rebecca would tell me I was overreacting, then proceed to explain why her decision was completely reasonable and not open for discussion. She's always been good at making herself sound logical, while making me feel like the crazy one. I sat back in my chair and let my mind wander to the last few holidays. There was the year I brought back a set of handmade ornaments from a deployment in Germany. She took one look at them and said, "Oh, these are nice, but they don't really match the theme I'm going for." Into the closet they went. Then there was the time I suggested taking Clara, her daughter, to visit the base. She told me it would disrupt Clara's routine and that it wasn't the right time. Right time for what? To spend time with her aunt who's been gone 9 months on orders? Last spring, I mailed a handwritten letter from Qatar, thinking it would be a nice personal touch. When I saw her a month later, she didn't even mention it. I brought it up myself, and she shrugged. "Oh yeah, I got it. Been busy." It's not like we were close growing up, but we weren't enemies either. Somewhere along the way, the gap between us turned into a wall, and I was always the one trying to climb it. The email sat open on my screen, and I noticed something else. She didn't say, "We'll miss you," or "Let's celebrate another time." She just closed the door, and I wasn't even sure who we meant. Her and her husband? Her and Mom? Speaking of Mom, I'd had a call with her the week before. She's in a retirement home back in Vermont, and I try to check in once a week. She mentioned almost offhand that Rebecca had been stressed about money. Something about the bank calling and Clara's school fees. I didn't ask for details. Not my business. At least it wasn't then. The more I thought about it, the more the email stopped, feeling like a one-off decision, and more like the final note in a song I'd been hearing for years. Every no to an offer, every brush off. Every time she positioned me just outside the circle. This wasn't new. It was just louder this time. I picked up my phone and read the email again, hoping maybe it would sting less the second or third time. It didn't. The polite phrasing almost made it worse. "Please don't take it personally," is basically code for, "I'm doing something hurtful, and you're not allowed to complain." I looked at the clock. Still an hour and 45 minutes until I could leave. I tried focusing on the maintenance report in front of me, but my mind kept drifting back. The thing about the military is you get used to people telling you where you can and can't be. Orders come down, you follow them. But that's work. Family shouldn't feel like orders. A knock at the door pulled me back. It was one of the younger pilots, dropping off some forms. He saw my face and asked if everything was all right. I said yeah, just a long day. I wasn't about to explain that I'd just been cut from Christmas by my own sister. Not in the middle of a workday. Not to a 24-year-old lieutenant who still calls his mom every night. When the office finally emptied out and I headed to my car, the Colorado air hit me cold, dry, and sharp enough to make you notice it. The mountains were lit up by the last bit of sunset, and for a second I thought about just driving west and not stopping. But I had a husband at home who'd want to know what was going on. Dan was in the kitchen when I walked in, still in his work clothes, sleeves rolled up, making something that smelled like chili. He asked how my day was, and I told him about the email. He didn't react right away, just kept stirring. Then he said, "So she just told you not to come? Just like that?" I nodded. He didn't look shocked, which was telling. He's seen the pattern too. "You know," he said, "we don't have to just sit here feeling sorry about it." I laughed because that's exactly what I was about to do, sit there and stew. He shrugged. "We could do something else, something better." I leaned against the counter, letting the warmth from the stove hit me. "Like what? Spend Christmas just the two of us?" He smirked. "Or more. We've got friends, neighbors, people who'd love to spend the holidays with us, people who actually want us around." The idea hung there while he ladled chili into bowls. I thought about how easy it would be to just say, "Fine, I won't go," and then do nothing. But that felt too much like letting Rebecca's email set the terms. Dinner was quiet, but my mind wasn't. If I didn't go to Vermont, I could do literally anything else. I could stay home, I could travel, I could plan something on my terms. For once, I could make the holiday about people who treated me like family, not people who acted like I was a guest they couldn't wait to leave. When we finished eating, Dan brought it up again. "You know, it wouldn't take much to pull something together. We've done it before, just never for Christmas." I told him I'd think about it, but I could already feel my stubborn side kicking in. If Rebecca wanted a Christmas without me, she was about to get exactly that, just not the way she pictured. Dan rinsed the bowls in the sink while I stood at the counter, arms crossed, thinking about the email like it was still glowing on my phone. The smell of chili hung in the kitchen, but my appetite was gone. I pulled out a stool and sat, my mind running through the reel of moments where Rebecca had made it clear I wasn't really part of her picture-perfect version of family. It went back farther than I liked to admit. The Christmas I brought back those handmade German ornaments from deployment, she'd barely looked at them before saying they didn't match her color palette. They disappeared into a closet. The year I suggested taking Clara to visit my base for an open house, Rebecca's response was an instant no, claiming it would mess up her schedule. Mess up her schedule? She was 11. One Thanksgiving, I flew in from Europe on 48 hours' notice, just to be there. I arrived with jet lag so bad I could have fallen asleep standing up, but I still helped set the table. Rebecca didn't even acknowledge it. She actually told me I should have planned my leave better so I could help cook. Even my letters didn't matter. I'd written from Qatar once, long and personal, with stories I couldn't post online. When I asked if she got it, she shrugged, said she'd been busy, and changed the subject to some neighbor's kitchen renovation. Mom's words from the week before floated back. "Your sister's been under a lot of stress with the bank and the school bills." She'd said it in that casual way that means it's not casual at all. That little detail made me wonder if this quiet Christmas was less about wanting calm and more about wanting control. Dan finished rinsing and came over, leaning on the counter. "You look like you're reviewing battle plans," he said. I smirked because that's exactly what it felt like running through each engagement, each little hit that didn't seem like much until you stack them together. It's funny how easy it is to explain away one or two slights. But when you line them up, Christmas ornaments, the open house rejection, the ignored letters, it stops looking like coincidence and starts looking like a strategy. And in our family, Rebecca's always been good at strategy when it comes to getting her way. I remembered last Easter. I'd offered to bring dessert, my pecan pie, the one everyone else loves. She told me not to bother because she had a theme and pie didn't fit. Pie didn't fit Easter? I didn't even ask. I showed up with a bottle of wine instead, which she barely touched. Dan shook his head. "She's been phasing you out for years. This email's just her finally putting it in writing." Hearing it out loud was like getting a diagnosis for something you already knew was wrong. I got up, walked to the living room, and grabbed the old photo album from under the coffee table. Not the digital kind, actual printed photos and sleeves. I flipped through, stopping at one from when I'd just made captain. We were standing side by side at Mom's house, Rebecca smiling with her arm around me. She'd given me a congratulatory card that day. I remember thinking maybe things were shifting. But the next time we spoke, she acted like my promotion was just more work and more uniforms. That card was still in the sleeve behind the photo. I pulled it out and read the one-line message again. "Congrats. I guess now you're really in charge of something." I'd kept it anyway. I keep a lot of things. Maybe because in the military you learn that some days a thin connection is better than none at all. I put the album back, sat on the couch, and thought about Mom again. She's the type who tries to keep the peace by never taking a side, which usually means she ends up backing Rebecca without even realizing it. When Mom mentioned the financial stress, I hadn't asked for details, but it stuck with me. Maybe because it lined up too neatly with Rebecca cutting me out this year. No big gathering means no awkward questions, no extra guests, no chance for anyone to notice if she's struggling. Dan came in and dropped onto the couch next to me. "You know," he said, "if this was a mission briefing, you'd be looking for patterns, and you'd already have your next move planned." I told him this wasn't a mission, it was family. He raised an eyebrow. "And? That makes it easier?" "Sounds harder to me." I leaned back and stared at the ceiling. "It's not just the email. It's all of it. Every time she's pushed me to the edges. I just kept showing up anyway, thinking one of these years it would change." Dan tilted his head toward me. "And now?" Now, I wasn't sure why I'd been giving her that benefit of the doubt for so long. Maybe because, in the military, you're trained to hold the line, even if you're standing there alone. Maybe because I wanted my niece to see me as part of the family. Or maybe because I didn't want to admit that some people don't change just because you hope they will. Dan reached over and grabbed the remote, muted the television that had been quietly running in the background. "So, what do you want to do? Stay home and pretend it's just another day? Or—" He let it hang there. The truth was, I didn't know yet. I only knew one thing for sure this year. Christmas wasn't going to be spent wondering why I wasn't welcome. If Rebecca wanted me out, fine. But I was going to decide what out looked like. I got up to put the kettle on, the kind of small, ordinary move that makes it easier to think. The water hissed and clicked as it heated, the sound filling the kitchen. Dan leaned in the doorway. "I'm just saying, we've got options. And people. More people than you think." I poured the water into 2 mugs, the steam curling up between us. "Options," I repeated. The word felt better than left out. It felt like a decision waiting to be made, not one that had been made for me. We sat at the table with our tea, not talking much, both of us knowing that if we talked too soon we might lock ourselves into something half-formed. I stared at the steam rising from my cup, thinking about every yes I'd given Rebecca over the years, and how easy it had been for her to give me a no. Somewhere in the back of my mind, a little switch flipped. Not a big, dramatic moment, just a quiet understanding that whatever I did next, it was going to be on my terms. And for the first time since reading that email, I didn't feel shut out. I felt ready. The next morning, I woke up before the alarm, the email still fresh in my mind like I'd read it minutes ago. Dan was already in the kitchen, making coffee, moving around with the kind of quiet efficiency he had from his Marine days. I stood in the doorway for a second, watching him pour water into the machine. The smell hit me before the drip even started. He glanced up. "You're up early." "Couldn't sleep," I said, walking over to grab 2 mugs from the shelf. We didn't talk about the email right away. Dan handed me the first cup, and we both leaned against the counter, drinking in silence. The only sound was the low hum of the fridge and the occasional clink of the spoon against ceramic. It wasn't until I set my mug down that I said, "If we don't go to Vermont, it's just going to be the 2 of us here." Dan nodded slowly, like he'd already thought this through. And I said, "I don't want to spend Christmas pretending it's just another Sunday." He gave a half smile. That's not exactly a detailed plan. Doesn't have to be. You know how to make things happen when you want to." I rolled my eyes. "You're making it sound like a mission." He shrugged. "Isn't it? Situations changed, so adapt." I walked over to the window and looked out at the thin layer of frost on the lawn. The street was quiet except for the occasional car heading toward the main road. If we did something here, it'd be small. Just us, maybe a couple of neighbors. Or, Dan said, we could go big. Rent somewhere nice. Invite everyone we actually like. Make it the kind of Christmas that makes you forget you were uninvited from anywhere else. I turned back toward him. Go big? In December? With 2 weeks' notice? Sure, he said, like it was the most obvious thing in the world. We've pulled off bigger things with less time. Remember that 4th of July barbecue in 2019? That was 12 people in the backyard and a grill that almost exploded. He grinned. Exactly. And it was great. I laughed, but the idea was already working its way in. I pictured a warm place with enough room for friends, maybe some of my old unit, and a few of Dan's Marine buddies. People who knew what it was like to be far from home for the holidays. People who wouldn't complain if the decorations weren't on theme. Dan walked over and tapped the counter like he was sealing the deal. We could do it in Aspen. Nice scenery, snow for the vibe, but still close enough to drive. Find a place with a big fireplace. You could hang that flag of yours, the one that went with you on all 3 deployments. The mention of the flag stopped me for a second. That flag had been in my rucksack through Europe, the Middle East, and back again. It had a burn mark from a flare during a training exercise. It wasn't perfect, but it was mine. The idea of it hanging above a roaring fire while we had people over actually made me smile. "You're serious about this," I said. "Completely. Why not make our own version of Christmas? Something you actually look forward to instead of feeling like you're trying to pass some test." I sat back down with my coffee. "If we do this, it's going to be a lot of work." "Work you like," he said, and he was right. Planning, organizing, pulling people together, it's not far from what I do in uniform, just with less paperwork and fewer rules about what counts as acceptable food. We spent the rest of breakfast throwing out ideas. Guest list, menu, decorations, who could make it on short notice, who'd be out of town, who might actually appreciate an invite to something that wasn't an awkward family dinner. By the time Dan left for work, the mood in the house had shifted. The email was still there, sitting in my inbox like a reminder, but it didn't feel like the last word anymore. It felt like the first push I needed to take the holiday back. I cleared the dishes and opened my laptop at the dining table. A quick search for Aspen vacation rentals brought up more results than I expected. Cabins, condos, full-on mountain lodges. Some were already booked solid, but a few were still open. I clicked through photos, wood ceilings, stone fireplaces, windows looking out on snow-covered pines. One in particular caught my eye. It wasn't over the top, but it was beautiful. 4 bedrooms, a big open kitchen, a dining table that could seat 12, and a living room with the kind of fireplace you could actually stand in front of without crouching. I could picture people gathered there, drinks in hand, laughing over stories. I checked the price, winced, then checked it again. It wasn't cheap, but it wasn't impossible. Dan and I had skipped vacations the last 2 years. We could swing it if we decided it mattered. And right now, it mattered. I hit Contact Host and sent a message about booking for Christmas weekend. Less than an hour later, they wrote back it was available. All they needed was a deposit. I stared at the confirm booking button for a few seconds. Once I clicked it, there'd be no going back. No half measures, no, maybe we'll just stay home. I could feel that stubborn streak again. The same one that made me push through night drills in freezing wind or deal with commanders who thought off-duty meant free labor. I clicked it. Confirmation popped up on the screen. Just like that, Christmas wasn't something I'd been pushed out of. It was something I was building from scratch. By late afternoon, I'd started a guest list in my notebook. I wrote down names fast, without overthinking people from the base, old friends from other stations, a couple of Dan's Marine buddies who lived nearby. Then I added neighbors who'd spent too many holidays alone. I even left space for people I hadn't talked to in a while, but knew would show up if asked. The list got longer than I expected, and instead of feeling overwhelmed, I felt lighter. I could see it in my head already. The villa lit up, music playing, people swapping stories from deployments and civilian life, kids running around without someone telling them they were off theme. Dan came home just as I was jotting down the last name. He saw the list and raised an eyebrow. "That's not small." I handed it to him. "You said go big." He grinned. "I like it." I opened my laptop again, pulling up a spreadsheet to keep track of invites, food, and whatever else came up. Dan leaned over my shoulder. "You're in full op mode now." "Yeah," I said. "I am." And for the first time since that email, I didn't feel like I was losing anything. I felt like I was finally setting the terms. By the next morning, the booking confirmation sat in my inbox like a signed contract, and I treated it exactly like that, a commitment I wasn't going to flake on. The payment had already cleared. Aspen was officially ours for Christmas weekend. The place looked even better in the daytime photos the owner sent over. Sunlight spilling through big windows, snow piled on the deck railing, and a fireplace with a mantel just begging for stockings. I sat at the dining table with my laptop open, coffee on my right, notebook on my left. My flag, the one that had been folded and stored since my last deployment, was tucked in the hall closet, but I already knew it was going to be the centerpiece. Not because I wanted to turn the whole thing into a military shrine, but because that flag had been through hell with me and was still here. It was the perfect, quiet statement. Dan came in halfway through his first cup of coffee and leaned on the back of my chair. "So what's the plan for decorating?" "I'm keeping it simple," I said, scribbling notes. "Lights, a tree, maybe some garlands. The flag above the fireplace." He smiled. "You're not doing one of those color-coordinated themes?" I shot him a look. "I'm not, Rebecca." "Fair point." I started breaking down the weekend by day arrival: Christmas Eve, Christmas Day, and the morning after. The arrival day would be casual, just getting people settled, handing out mugs of cider or cocoa, making sure nobody felt like they'd walked into something too formal. I wanted it warm, relaxed, and impossible to fake. The food list came next. I wasn't going to stress over a 4-course gourmet menu. Instead, I picked things people actually liked eating: slow-roasted beef tenderloin, mashed potatoes, roasted vegetables, and a couple of seafood dishes for variety. For dessert, I'd bake my pecan pie, whether or not it fit any theme. Dan threw in the idea of homemade eggnog, which I was willing to try as long as he handled the mixing. By mid-morning, I'd sent out the first batch of invitations, texts, calls, a few emails for the people I didn't see often. I didn't mention anything about being uninvited from Vermont. No point in making it about that. This was an open, positive invite. "We're having Christmas in Aspen this year. Plenty of space. Come if you can." The responses started coming in almost immediately. One friend from my unit texted back, "I thought I was going to be sitting in my apartment alone. Count me in." Another wrote, "If you've got room for my kids, they'd love to see snow." Even a couple of the neighbors replied right away, surprised but excited. Dan's phone buzzed with his own confirmations. Marine buddies who'd been through enough holidays in base cafeterias to appreciate a home-cooked meal. He gave me a thumbs up from across the room. "Looks like we're going to have a full house." I pulled up the rental listing again, this time to check the kitchen setup. Double ovens, big fridge, plenty of counter space. It was like the place was designed for someone to pull off a large holiday dinner without losing their mind. We spent the afternoon picking up a few things we knew we'd need: extra strings of lights, stocking hooks, and serving dishes. Nothing that screamed luxury, just the basics to make the place feel lived in. In one store, I spotted a box of simple red and white stockings. 10 of them. I grabbed the box without thinking. When we got home, I unpacked them on the couch and pulled one aside. That one stayed empty. Not because I didn't have enough people to fill it for, but because an empty stocking says more than any gift inside. It would hang there as a quiet reminder to me, mostly that absence can be its own statement. Dan noticed it right away. "That one's for decoration?" I nodded. "Yeah, just feels right." He didn't push for an explanation, which is one of the reasons I married him. Later that night, I started drafting a loose seating plan. Not a rigid one, just enough to make sure nobody felt stuck on the fringe. In the military, you learn quickly how to integrate people who've never met into one conversation. A good table mix could do more for morale than any speech. I also made a mental note to have a small table set up for the kids. Keep them happy, keep the adults sane. I even jotted down a few games and activities to pack. Nothing too complicated: cards, puzzles, maybe a couple of those build-your-own ornament kits. While I was at it, I made sure to plan for downtime. Not every second of the weekend needed to be scheduled. If someone wanted to just sit by the fire with a book or watch the snow, they should feel like that was part of the plan, not like they were skipping out. By the time I closed my notebook, the shape of the weekend had started to feel real. Not just an idea, but something you could walk into. Something with its own atmosphere. Dan came back from the garage, carrying the storage bin with our Christmas lights. "Thought we could test these before we go. Make sure we're not stuck buying new ones last minute." I helped him untangle them, a process that always made me wonder how they managed to knot themselves up in storage. When we plugged them in, all but one string lit up. Dan tossed the bad one aside. "We'll pick up a new box tomorrow." The good strings, though, gave off a warm, soft light that made the living room look like it was already halfway to Aspen. I sat on the couch, watching the glow bounce off the walls. The empty stocking was still on the armrest next to me. I looped the hanger around my finger, twirling it absently, thinking about how different this Christmas was already shaping up to be. In the back of my head, I could almost hear the noise of people arriving, boots stomping snow off at the door, laughter echoing in the high-ceilinged living room. It wasn't about showing anyone up. It wasn't about sending a message. At least, not one I'd put into words. It was about filling the space I'd been pushed out of with something that actually mattered to me. Dan sat down beside me, still holding a coil of lights. "You're picturing it, aren't you?" "Yeah," I said. "Clear as day." And once I could see it, I knew it wasn't going to just be a plan on paper. It was going to happen exactly the way I wanted it to. The next day, I took my notebook back to the table and started refining the guest list. The original scribbles from the night before were a mix of names and half-formed ideas. Now it was time to decide who I really wanted in that room. This wasn't going to be a fill-the-space kind of party. If they came, it was because they'd bring something good to the table, stories, laughter, or just the kind of calm that makes everyone else feel welcome. I started with people from the base. Sergeant Miller, who'd spent last year's Christmas in a hotel lobby because his flight got canceled. Captain Ramirez, who made the best tamales I've ever had and had a way of turning any conversation into something worth listening to. I texted them both, got quick yeses. Then I added friends I hadn't seen in years but knew would show up without hesitation. Like Allison, from my first duty station, she's the kind of person who will happily stay up until 2 a.m., helping you set tables just because she thinks it's fun. Dan was in the garage, so I called out, "Who from your side's a definite yes?" He yelled back, "Henderson for sure, and maybe Lewis if he can get leave approved. Oh, and don't forget about Carter, he's in Denver now." I secrete. I wrote them down, then added a note to check if they'd bring spouses or kids. More people meant more food, but I'd rather plan for that now than scramble later. By mid-morning, I'd sent 20 invitations. Most replied fast, and the answer was almost always yes. A few people couldn't commit yet, but that was fine. I had enough confirmations to know the place wouldn't feel empty. One reply made me pause. It was from Major Chris Dalton, someone I hadn't served with directly but who had been in the same unit during a rough deployment. He texted, "Heard about Aspen from Ramirez. If the invite's open, I'd like to come. Haven't had a Christmas that wasn't in uniform for a while." I didn't even hesitate, sent him the details. While the responses rolled in, I pulled up the villa floor plan the owner had sent. Big, open living space, plenty of seating, even a separate lounge area off the main room. I started sketching where things could go: tree in the corner near the big windows, food table along the wall by the kitchen, drinks set up on the sideboard. It wasn't just logistics, it was about flow. People need to feel like they can move around without bumping elbows all night. And I wanted those little clusters of conversation that happen naturally when you give people room to breathe. Dan came in around noon, wiping his hands on a rag. "Garage is clear. We can load everything into the truck the night before." He glanced at my notebook. "That's a lot of names." I shrugged. "Better than staring at an empty room." "Yeah," he said. "And I like this crowd. They're the kind who'll actually enjoy being there, not just show up because they feel like they have to." We spent the afternoon making calls, not just to invite people, but to feel out what they might bring. I didn't want a formal potluck, but if someone had a specialty dish, it only made sense to let them show it off. Ramirez immediately offered his tamales. Miller said he could bring smoked brisket, and Allison texted, "Do you want pies? Because I'm bringing pies." By the time the sun went down, we had a clear picture of the mix. Military friends, a few close civilian friends, some neighbors, and their kids. No one on the list felt like a polite obligation. After dinner, Dan and I sat in the living room with our laptops, each of us checking travel routes and weather forecasts. Aspen in December could mean smooth driving or chains on the tires conditions. We made a note to tell guests to leave early and bring gear for snow. The last thing I wanted was someone stuck on the pass in a whiteout because they underestimated the Rockies. While Dan was reading road reports, I opened the box of stockings again. I started labeling them with names, not the fancy embroidered kind, just small gift tags tied with twine. One for each confirmed guest. I set the empty one aside again, hanging it over the back of a chair. It was simple, but it was part of the plan now. Dan noticed me looking at it. "Still keeping that one empty?" "Yeah," I said. "For Rebecca?" I looked at him for a second before answering. "Not for her. For me. To remember this wasn't an accident. It was a choice." He nodded like he understood exactly what I meant. Later that night, I sent one more text. It wasn't to invite someone new. It was to confirm with the villa owner about check-in and any quirks of the place we should know about. She replied with a list how to work the heating system, where the extra blankets were, which cupboard had the board games. Practical details, but the kind that make you feel like you're stepping into a place you can make your own. Before bed, I flipped through my notebook one last time. The list of names filled almost 2 pages now, and under it, a smaller list had started forming things I still needed to buy, tasks to do in the next few days, calls to make. It didn't feel overwhelming. It felt like a mission with a clear objective and the right people on board. Dan glanced over my shoulder. "Looks like you've got it under control." "I do," I said. And I meant it. When I closed the notebook and set it on the table, I didn't see a pile of work waiting. I saw a weekend that was going to be exactly what I wanted it to be. Full, loud, and completely on my terms. The following morning, I cleared off the dining table and spread out everything: lists, catalogs, my laptop, and a pen that was already running out of ink. Dan came in halfway through his first cup of coffee and raised an eyebrow. "You're in full op mode." "Exactly," I said. "No point pretending this is casual. If we're doing this, we're doing it right." The villa owner had sent more photo shots of the living room from different angles, the deck covered in fresh snow, and a wide kitchen island that could double as a buffet station. I pinned them to my corkboard with sticky notes. Tree here, drink station here, flag over fireplace. First stop was decorations. I wanted it festive but not staged. No perfectly matched ornaments or fake rustic signs that looked like they'd been bought in bulk. We went to the local hardware store for extra lights, then hit a thrift shop where I scored a box of vintage glass ornaments for next to nothing. Dan found an old wooden sled in the corner, dusty but solid. "We could clean this up and put it on the deck," he said. It was exactly the kind of detail that would make the place feel like a real winter getaway. By midday, we'd filled the back of the truck with bins, lights, garland, candles, and a couple of artificial wreaths that smelled faintly of pine if you stood close enough. Back home, I spread everything out and grouped it by where it would go in the villa. Next was the menu. I sat with my notebook and blocked out each meal arrival night's casual chili and cornbread, Christmas Eve's potluck spread, and Christmas Day's main dinner. Ramirez's tamales went on the Eve list, Miller's brisket on Christmas Day. Allison's pies got their own line, because if there's one thing I've learned, it's that pie logistics are serious business. Dan volunteered for drinks duty, mulled wine, hot cider, and that eggnog experiment he was still talking about. I told him he could also handle beer and soda because no one should have to go searching for a drink. We decided to do a supply run early, so we wouldn't be fighting last-minute crowds. The base commissary had most of what we needed, and for the rest, we hit a warehouse store. People stared a little at the 2 carts piled high with flour, sugar, meat, and enough butter to clog the arteries of an entire platoon, but I didn't care. Back at home, I turned the garage into staging non-perishables in one corner, decorations in another, and a growing pile of labeled bins. I taped a list of contents to each one because nothing kills momentum like digging through 4 boxes just to find the one bag of tea lights you know you packed. While I was labeling, Dan came in holding the storage bin with my flag. "Want to check it?" he asked. I nodded. We unfolded it carefully, the fabric still holding that faint, sun-baked scent from overseas. The burn mark near one edge was exactly as I remembered. I ran my hand over it, not to smooth it out, but to make sure it was still there. "This is going to be the first thing people see when they walk in," I said. "Good," Dan replied. "Let them know right away whose house they're in." That night, I sent out a quick update to everyone coming, reminding them about the weather, telling them to bring boots, and letting them know we'd have plenty of blankets and hot drinks. Almost every reply was excited, and a few people offered to help set up once they arrived. The next day, I started thinking about the flow of the weekend beyond food and decorations. We needed music, something in the background that could shift from holiday classics to whatever got people dancing later in the night. I built a playlist, heavy on the stuff that made people smile without rolling their eyes. I also dug out my camera. Not for posed group shots, but for the in-between moments, someone laughing mid-story, kids falling over in the snow, Dan holding a drink while pretending not to get dragged into a game. I charged the batteries and packed extra memory cards. Midweek, a package arrived, a set of heavy ceramic mugs I'd ordered online. Each one was slightly different, but all of them felt solid in your hand. Perfect for cider, cocoa, or whatever Dan decided to spike with bourbon. I washed them and wrapped them in towels so they'd be ready to travel. Dan spent one evening in the garage fixing up that sled he'd found. By the time he was done, the wood was smooth, the metal runners polished, and it looked like something straight out of an old Christmas postcard. He leaned it against the wall with a satisfied nod. "That's gonna look good by the door." End quote. As the week went on, the plans stopped feeling like a plan and started feeling like something that was already in motion. The bins in the garage were stacked neatly, the menu was set, the playlist was done, and the guest list was confirmed. Every step made the idea of this Christmas in Aspen more tangible. On Friday night, I stood in the kitchen, flipping through my notebook one last time. Dan came up behind me, glanced over my shoulder and said, "You know, for someone who got uninvited from Christmas, you're about to throw one that's better than half the ones people get invited to." I laughed. That's kind of the point. He kissed the top of my head and went back to the garage to check the tire chains. I closed the notebook, slid it into my bag, and looked around the living room. The lights we'd tested earlier still hung across the window, casting that same warm glow. Everything we needed was ready to go. All that was left was to load the truck, hit the road, and turn all these plans into something you could walk into, sit down in, and not want to leave. We left early enough to beat the midday traffic into the mountains. The road up to Aspen was clear, sunlight bouncing off snowbanks that rose higher the closer we got. Dan drove, steady as ever, while I checked my list one last time. Everything in the back was strapped down: bins of decorations, boxes of food, the sled, and my flag, folded neatly in its own case. When we pulled into the villa's driveway, the place looked even better than in the pictures. The snow on the roof was thick, but the path to the front door had been shoveled clean. I stepped out and took a breath of the cold air that felt sharper than anything in Colorado Springs. Inside, the heat was already on. The first thing I did was walk to the fireplace and set the flag case on the mantel. Dan brought in the bins, and we moved fast tree in the corner, lights strung along the windows, stockings hung on hooks over the mantel with the empty one right in the center. The sled went just outside on the deck, leaning against the railing. By the time the first guests arrived, the place was glowing literally. The tree lights reflected off the glass ornaments, the kitchen smelled faintly of cinnamon from the cider warming on the stove, and music played low in the background. Sergeant Miller was first through the door, stomping snow off his boots. "This is not what I expected," he said, glancing around. "That's good, right?" I asked. "Oh yeah," he grinned. "Definitely good." "Oh." People trickled in after that: Ramirez with a foil-covered tray of tamales, Allison carrying a box labeled P, "Do Not Tilt," Dan's Marine buddies with six-packs tucked under their arms. The sound level in the room doubled with every arrival, conversations starting and overlapping like they'd all known each other for years. I moved from group to group, making introductions when needed, topping off drinks, pointing people toward the coat rack. The whole point was to make it easy, nobody standing around awkwardly, nobody wondering if they were supposed to pitch in. At one point, Major Dalton arrived, a little later than planned. He stepped inside, shook my hand firmly, and said, "It's been a while since I walked into a place and felt like it mattered who was there." Then he handed me a wrapped package and added, "Don't open it until tomorrow, our day." The chili I'd made earlier simmered on the stove, and people started serving themselves without me having to announce anything. Plates balanced on laps, drinks in hand, they settled into the couches and chairs. The room felt full, in the best possible way. Dan put the sled to use faster than I thought. A group went outside after dinner, taking turns sliding down the small hill behind the villa. Even a couple of the older guests gave it a try, coming back in laughing and brushing snow off their jackets. Inside, conversations drifted between holiday plans, deployment stories, and the usual friendly trash talk that comes when people who've served together are in the same room. Ramirez ended up telling a story about the time he and his team tried to cook Christmas dinner on a tiny propane stove in Afghanistan, and it turned into an unplanned fireworks show. Everyone laughed so hard, they nearly missed the part where he admitted they still ate the burned food because it was the only thing they had. By late evening, the plates were mostly cleared, and the cider pot was nearly empty. People were still talking, still moving between rooms, but there was no sense of anyone waiting for the main event. The gathering itself was the point. I caught Dan's eye across the room, He gave me a small nod, his way of saying it was working. I didn't need to check the list or adjust anything. The night was taking on its own rhythm, and it was exactly the kind I'd wanted. In the kitchen, Allison was cutting one of her pies, offering slices to anyone walking by. She caught me watching and said, "You know, this is the kind of Christmas people actually remember. Not the perfectly staged kind, but the one where you can breathe." I poured myself a mug of cider, leaned against the counter, and listened. Laughter from the living room. The low thud of boots on the deck outside. Someone humming along to the music. It wasn't about proving a point anymore, not in that moment. It was about the fact that we'd filled this space with people who wanted to be here. No strings attached. And as more guests arrived, shaking snow off their coats and stepping into the warmth, it was clear we weren't anywhere near done. Snow was still falling the next morning when I made coffee for the early risers. Miller was already up, sitting by the window with a mug, watching the flakes drift past the deck. We talked quietly for a bit until more people started trickling in Ramirez looking for leftover tamales, Allison pulling pie from the fridge like it was breakfast food. After a while, people began pulling out their phones. Someone had taken a photo the night before of the group crammed around the tree. Everyone mid-laugh. Another had caught Dan outside holding the sled, cheeks red from the cold. There were shots of kids making snow angels, guests toasting mugs of cider, and one perfectly timed image of Dalton trying not to lose his balance on the hill. I didn't tell anyone to post them, but they did. And once they started, the photos spread fast. Tagging friends led to friends tagging other friends, and by mid-afternoon, my phone buzzed non-stop with notifications. Most were from people at the party sharing their own shots, but a few were from folks who weren't there liking, commenting, sending messages. I knew the second I saw Rebecca's name pop up in my notifications that she'd seen them. One of her friends must have been tagged by someone here. The photo she would have seen first was a wide shot of the living room tree lit, flag over the fireplace, stockings lined up, every face in the frame smiling. Right in the middle was the empty stocking. By early evening, I had 17 missed calls from her. They came in clusters, 2 or 3 back-to-back, then a pause, then another round. I didn't answer any of them. I wasn't about to drag that energy into the middle of what was shaping up to be the best Christmas I'd had in years. She started texting next. First, "Call me." Then, "We need to talk." Then, "This is important." The messages got shorter after that, like she was running out of patience. I set the phone face down on the counter and kept moving through the night like nothing had happened. Guests were playing a board game in the corner. Dan was refilling drinks, and the kitchen was alive with people picking at leftovers. Every now and then, my phone would buzz again, but I didn't look. Later, while most people were busy with dessert, I stepped into the hallway to grab a sweater from my bag. That's when I noticed the voicemail icon. Curiosity got the better of me, and I put the phone to my ear. Her voice came through sharp. "No warm-up. We need to meet. It's urgent. I don't care what you're doing right now, call me back." There was a pause, like she might add something else, but then it cut off. I stood there for a second, sweater in one hand, phone in the other. Urgent could mean a lot of things, but coming from her, I doubted it had anything to do with health or safety. More likely, it was about control, about the fact that I'd just pulled off something she couldn't. Dan found me in the hall and asked if everything was fine. I nodded, just Rebecca being Rebecca. He didn't press, just shrugged and went back to the living room. When I returned, the game in the corner had turned into loud laughter. Someone had started another round of music, and the smell of fresh popcorn filled the air. I sank into the couch between 2 friends and let the noise wrap around me. The phone stayed in my pocket, silent now. The rest of the night rolled on easily. People drifted between conversations, stepped outside for fresh air, came back in to warm up by the fire. At one point, Miller passed me his phone to show me a photo someone else had posted me in the kitchen, mid-laugh, with the flag in the background and the tree lights catching in my hair. "Looks like you're having a good time," he said. "I am," I told him, and I meant it without qualifiers. Somewhere between the music and the laughter, the buzzing phone didn't feel like a threat anymore. It was just noise outside the circle we'd built here, and nothing outside that circle was getting in. 3 days after we got back from Aspen, my phone lit up again with her name. This time it wasn't a call or a text, it was an email. Short, clipped, and formal, like she was writing to someone she barely knew. We should meet in person, coffee, this week. There was no question mark. Dan glanced over my shoulder while I read it. You're actually thinking about going? I'm not thinking about it, I said, shutting the laptop. I'm going. We agreed on a cafe halfway between our towns. Neutral territory. The kind of place where the tables were small, the coffee came in paper cups, and there was just enough noise from the espresso machine to make conversations feel private without being hidden. I got there first. Picked a corner table facing the door. I wasn't nervous, but I was braced like before a briefing where you know the questions aren't going to be friendly. She walked in 15 minutes late, scanning the room like she was looking for someone she didn't actually want to see. When her eyes landed on me, she smiled just enough to pass for polite, then sat down without taking off her coat. I'll get coffee, I said, standing up. She shook her head. I'm fine. That told me everything I needed to know about how this was going to go. So, I started. You wanted to meet. Her hand stayed in her lap. I saw your event. She said it like it was a minor traffic accident. I didn't answer. Let the silence do the work. Finally, she sighed. Things have been rough for us lately. Us? I asked. She looked away, then back at me. The bank's on us about the mortgage. And with Mike out of work, Clara's tuition, well, you know how expensive it's gotten. I nodded once. No sympathy, no judgment, just acknowledgement. She leaned forward slightly. You have connections. Military, government. You could help us get a better loan. Or maybe get Mike a job. Just something to get us back on track. There it was. Not even 10 minutes in. And the real reason for this meeting was on the table. I can't do that, I said. Her eyes narrowed. You won't do that. Same answer. I reached into my bag and slid an envelope across the table. She hesitated before picking it up. Inside was a list of local financial advisors, contact information for veteran support programs Mike qualified for, and links to job placement services that specialized in skilled trades. She stared at it like I'd handed her a used grocery receipt. This isn't what I meant. It's what you can actually use, I told her. Her voice rose, just enough to turn a few heads from nearby tables. I thought family was supposed to help each other. Family doesn't mean having a blank check, I said. It means showing up when it counts. You told me not to show up. That landed harder than I expected. Her mouth opened, then closed again. She set the envelope down like it had burned her fingers. You've changed, she said finally. I smiled just enough to make it clear I wasn't sorry. Yeah, I stopped asking for permission to be in my own life. We sat there for a few more seconds, neither of us moving toward the other. Then she stood, slipped the envelope back toward me, and walked out without saying goodbye. I didn't follow. I didn't even watch her leave. I just sat back, took a slow breath, and felt the kind of quiet that isn't empty, it's just finally free of noise. When I stepped outside, the cold air hit like a reset button. I pulled my coat tighter and headed for the truck, already knowing I wouldn't be hearing from her in any way that mattered for a long time. Dan was in the garage when I got home, hands deep in a box of tools. He glanced up as I walked in. Well, she wanted money, I said. He set the wrench down slowly. Of course she did. I tossed my coat onto the bench and leaned against the wall. Not just money, a better loan, a job for Mike. Basically, a full rescue package. And you told her no? He said, more statement than question. I gave her resources, the kind that might actually help. He let out a short laugh. Let me guess she didn't say thank you. Not even close. We didn't need to keep talking about it. The whole thing felt like a box I'd already shut and put on a shelf. But there was still that static in the air, the kind you get after a storm moves through but the ground's still wet. Later that night, I opened my laptop and sent Clara a short message. Nothing about the meeting, nothing about her parents, just a simple check-in. She replied almost instantly, telling me school was fine, winter formal was coming up, and she'd made the honor roll again. I told her I was proud of her, and that was that. For the next few weeks, I kept busy. Work on base picked up after New Year's, and I found myself running back-to-back training schedules. There's something about being in uniform, boots hitting the tarmac, that strips away the leftover weight of civilian drama. But every now and then, I'd catch myself thinking about that envelope on the cafe table. She could have walked out with it, used it, maybe even surprised me by doing something without turning it into a debt. Instead, she left it behind like it was useless. One Saturday morning, Dan and I decided to clear out the garage. Halfway through, I spotted the sled leaning in the corner, still dusted with bits of dried snow. I ran my hand along the wood, remembering how it looked on the deck in Aspen. It wasn't just a decoration, it was proof we could build something good on our own terms. I set it aside, cleaned it up, and hung it on the wall where we'd see it every time we came in. In the kitchen that evening, Dan poured 2 glasses of bourbon and slid one to me. "So, is this the part where you start wondering if you should have handled it differently?" I shook my head. This is the part where I realize I don't have to fix people who don't want to fix themselves." He raised his glass. "To knowing the difference." We clinked and drank, the kind of quiet between us that didn't need filling. The next morning, I got an email from a mutual acquaintance in town. They'd heard about my sister's situation, her version of it anyway, and wanted to get my side. I replied with one sentence. "There's nothing to get my side about." That was the moment it really hit me. I didn't owe explanations, just like I didn't owe favors. Boundaries weren't walls, they were doors. I gotta decide when to open, and in this case, it was staying shut. From then on, any time her name came up in conversation, I kept it simple. Haven't talked to her. End of story. No details, no excuses. It wasn't avoidance, it was control. By February, the air had shifted. The drama wasn't gone, but it had moved far enough away that it wasn't sitting on my chest anymore. Dan noticed it too. One night over dinner, he said, "You seem lighter." End of 20. "I am," I told him, and I meant it. There's a certain freedom in not chasing approval from someone who's made a career out of withholding it. I'd thought saying no would feel harsh, but it didn't. It felt clean. That's the thing no one tells you about setting boundaries. You think it'll make life smaller, but it doesn't. It makes room for things that actually matter. And right now, I had plenty of those. March came in with a cold snap, the kind that kept the wind biting even on sunny days. My schedule at the base was relentless rotating training sessions, readiness drills, and paperwork that seemed to regenerate every time I thought I'd caught up. It was a perfect buffer against personal nonsense. I hadn't heard a word from Rebecca since that cafe meeting. No texts, no calls, no passive-aggressive posts online that somehow found their way to me through mutuals. It was like she'd hit pause on acknowledging I existed, which honestly worked for me. Then, one Thursday evening, after a long day running airfield coordination, I walked in to find a plain envelope on the kitchen counter. Dan said it had come in the mail, no return address. Inside was a letter in her handwriting. It wasn't long, 1 page, double-spaced like she was afraid the words might crowd each other. The first paragraph opened with a line I'd seen from her before. "I just don't understand why you're acting like this." The next part blamed me for driving a wedge in the family, for publicly excluding them from my Christmas, and for making everything about appearances. There was nothing about the cafe meeting, nothing about the help I'd offered, and certainly no admission about telling me not to come in the first place. I read it once, set it down, and didn't pick it up again. Dan glanced at me, waiting for some kind of reaction. "Same song, same verse," I said. He nodded, slid the letter into a drawer, and that was that. We didn't bring it up again. The weeks kept moving. Training cycles wrapped, and I got reassigned to oversee a short-term project at Nellis Air Force Base in Nevada. Being back in a different operational environment felt good. New faces, fresh pace, less room for my mind to wander toward Vermont. Still, silence has a way of making you notice its edges. In the absence of contact, I started to realize something. The peace I was feeling wasn't just from her staying quiet. It was from me not filling the quiet with my own overthinking. I wasn't rehearsing comebacks or replaying old arguments. I was just living. One evening in late April, I was running pre-flight checks when my phone buzzed in my jacket pocket. It was an unknown number. Normally I'd let it go to voicemail, but something made me answer. "Hey, it's Clara," came the voice on the other end. I had to borrow a friend's phone. Mine's dead." Her tone was lighter than I expected. She told me about school, a couple of clubs she'd joined, and the fact she was thinking about summer programs. Then, almost as an afterthought, she said, "Mom doesn't know I'm calling." I didn't push for details. "You don't need a reason to call me," I said. "I know. she replied. I just wanted to. After we hung up, I sat in the cab of the truck for a minute, hands resting on the steering wheel. That call, out of the blue, said more than any letter or argument ever could. The silence between Rebecca and me wasn't some tragic rift, it was space. And in that space, the right people could still find their way through. By the time I got back to the house that weekend, Dan had grilled steaks and opened a bottle of wine. We ate on the deck, the spring air finally warming up enough to make it comfortable. Halfway through dinner, he asked, "Still nothing from her?" "Nope," I said, cutting into my steak. "And you know what? I'm okay with that." He smiled, not the smug kind, but the one that said he could see I meant it. The thing about silence is, people think it's empty. But sometimes, it's just full of all the noise you decided not to carry anymore. And standing there on that deck, with the sun dipping low and the grill smoke drifting away, I knew I wasn't going back to the way it was. The first week of July, the heat in Colorado hit that dry, sharp peak where stepping outside felt like opening an oven door. I was halfway through a post-run stretch when my phone buzzed with a text from a number I didn't recognize. "Hey, it's Clara. I got into this summer career program in Colorado Springs. Starts in 2 weeks. Can I stay with you?" I read it twice, then thumbed back a quick, "Of course. Send me your flight details." 5 minutes later, she replied with a screenshot of her program confirmation. The location was less than a 10-minute drive from the base. I didn't need to ask why she'd chosen this one, it was obvious. When I told Dan, he raised an eyebrow. "Your sister's okay with this?" "Probably not," I said, pouring a glass of water. "But Clara's 17. She's old enough to make a choice." "How?" Over the next 2 weeks, we got the guest room ready, fresh sheets, desk cleared, small stack of notepads and pens on top. Dan insisted on putting a small bookshelf in the corner, loading it with a mix of military history, travel guides, and a couple of light novels. "She should have options," he said. The day she arrived, I spotted her before she saw me coming down the escalator in jeans, sneakers, and a t-shirt with the logo of her high school debate club. She smiled when she saw me, a real one, not the polite kind you give relatives out of obligation. "Your hair's shorter," she said as we hugged. "Easier to deal with under a helmet," I replied. On the drive back, she told me about her program, mock interviews, industry tours, skills, workshops. "They said there's even a day at the Air Force Academy," she added. I smirked. "Guess you'll have an inside guide." Her first few days were packed. She'd leave early in the morning, come back in the late afternoon with a stack of handouts and a head full of stories. One night over dinner, she said, "We did a session on leadership today. The instructor told us about decision-making under pressure, and I thought about you." I raised an eyebrow. Hopefully in a good way. She laughed. "Yeah, you know, holding your ground." That weekend, I took her to the base. Not a tourist show, just a quiet walk through the hangar, letting her see the planes up close. She peppered me with questions: how fast they could go, what the missions were like, how long it took to learn certain maneuvers. When we passed my office, she paused at the framed flag on the wall, the same one from Aspen, still showing the scorch mark from the flare incident. "That went everywhere with you?" she asked. "Everywhere that mattered," I said. She didn't say anything right away, just stood there looking at it. Finally, she nodded. "Makes sense." Later that night, she helped Dan with dinner while I handled a few work emails. I could hear them talking in the kitchen about the program, about books, about a barbecue Dan was planning. She sounded relaxed, like she belonged here. After dinner, she lingered in the living room while we cleaned up. When I came back, she was curled up in the armchair, phone in hand. "I didn't tell Mom I'm staying here," she said without looking up. "You don't have to explain it to me," I told her. She set her phone down. "I just didn't want it to turn into a fight." I didn't press her. The important thing was that she'd chosen where she wanted to be. And sitting there in that quiet, I realized something. Sometimes the biggest shift in a family doesn't come from confrontation. It comes from the moment someone decides they're done playing by rules that never worked for them. Clara had made that decision, and I wasn't about to let her regret it. By the second week of Clara's stay, our mornings had a rhythm. She'd head out early with her program group, and I'd be on base before sunrise for briefings and training runs. In the evenings, we'd meet back at the house, swap stories over dinner, and sometimes sit out on the deck until the sky turned from orange to deep blue. One Saturday, her program didn't have any activities, so I decided to show her more than just the hangar. We signed her in at the gate, and I took her to the simulation wing. "You ever flown anything?" I asked. "Only in video games," she grinned. "Well, this isn't a joystick and a couch." I set her up in the simulator for an F-16 training scenario, low stakes, but enough to give her the feel. The first few minutes were pure chaos, her overcorrecting, jerking the controls, but then she steadied, listening to my short, clipped instructions. When she landed without a crash, she looked over at me like she'd just pulled off a magic trick. "That was insane," she said, pulling off the headset. "That was basic," I corrected, smiling. "But you didn't freeze. That's the point." Afterward, we stopped by the memorial wall. I told her about the pilots whose names were etched there, men and women I'd trained with, eaten with, laughed with. She didn't interrupt, just listened. When I finished, she traced a fingertip over one of the engraved names. "You knew all of them?" she asked quietly. "Most," I said, "and I carry the rest anyway." That night, back at the house, Clara seemed quieter. Over dinner, she finally said, "I think I get why you fight so hard to keep certain things in your life and certain people out." Ep and da. I raised an eyebrow. "You've been thinking about this a lot." She nodded. "It's exhausting being in a constant fight, even when it's not yours. I'm just tired of the tension at home. When I'm here, it's calm." Dan leaned back in his chair. Calm is underrated. The next weekend, Clara helped me reorganize the storage shed. At one point, she spotted the old sled from Aspen hanging on the wall. "That's from the Christmas trip?" she asked. "Yep," I said. "It earned that spot." "That's," she laughed, shaking her head. "You really keep stuff that means something, don't you?" "Otherwise, it's just clutter," I told her. Midway through her last week, her program had its career day at the Air Force Academy. I tagged along as a guest speaker, running a short session on teamwork under stress. From the back of the room, I caught her watching me with this focused, almost proud expression. After the session, she came up. Everyone in there was talking about how cool it was you actually serve. Some of them didn't even know what Space Force does. "Most people don't," I said with a smirk. Her last evening before heading home, we had a small cookout. Just the three of us. Some music low in the background, and the kind of conversation that wandered everywhere. She didn't bring up her mom, and I didn't either. It wasn't the point. As the sun went down, Clara leaned back in her chair. "I'm glad I came," she said simply. I looked at her and knew she meant it. The thing is, sometimes you don't see the full weight of a season until you're at the end of it. That summer wasn't about fixing anything between me and Rebecca. It was about showing Clara another version of family, one without strings, without the constant ledger of debts and favors. And sitting there, I realized I wasn't just giving her a break from the tension. I was showing her the blueprint for something better. By the time December rolled back around, the snow in Colorado had already covered the yard in a clean, unbroken sheet. Dan and I had been talking about Christmas plans since October, but it wasn't until mid-month that we locked it in Aspen again. Same villa, same quiet streets lined with lights, same sense that we could shape the holiday exactly how we wanted. This time, Clara was part of the plan from the start. She'd been texting me since the summer, dropping hints about how much she'd love to see the mountains in winter. 2 weeks before Christmas, she confirmed she was coming, flying into Denver, catching a shuttle up to Aspen. The villa looked just as I remembered: warm wood, big windows, a fireplace that seemed to heat the whole place with a single log. We unpacked, set up the small tree in the corner, and hung stockings. Mine, Dan's, and one with Clara, stitched across the top. Off to the side, I hung the old empty stocking again, the one I'd left in Aspen the first year. Not as a statement this time, just as part of the story. Clara arrived 2 days later, stepping in from the cold with a grin and a scarf wrapped twice around her neck. She handed me a small, neatly wrapped box. "Open it later," she said, brushing snow off her coat. We settled into the rhythm quickly. Mornings with coffee and breakfast while the snow fell outside. Afternoons exploring the shops or walking along the frozen river. At night, we'd make dinner together or eat at one of the small local places where everyone seemed to know everyone else. On Christmas Eve, we invited a handful of friends, mostly people I'd served with, plus a couple of neighbors from back home who happened to be in Aspen for the holidays. It wasn't a big crowd, but it was the right one. No posturing, no undercurrent of grudges, just people who genuinely wanted to be there. At one point in the evening, I noticed Clara standing by the fireplace, talking with Chris Dalton, an old friend from my unit. She was laughing, totally at ease. Dan caught me watching and leaned over. "You look like you just checked off a box." "Not a box," I said. "More like I just saw something work out exactly how it should." End of Dinner was loud in the best way, plates being passed, conversations overlapping, the kind of warmth that comes from more than just the heat in the room. After the dishes were cleared, Clara slipped away for a minute and came back holding that wrapped box she'd given me on the first day. Inside was a framed photo of the three of us from the summer, me, her, and Dan on the deck, the mountains behind us. On the bottom edge of the frame, she'd written in neat black letters, "Home is where you're wanted." I didn't say anything right away, just pulled her into a hug, long enough for her to know I got it. That night, after everyone left and the place had gone quiet, I sat by the fire with a glass of bourbon. The snow outside reflected the soft glow from the windows, and the room felt like it was holding on to every bit of warmth it could. Dan was in the kitchen rinsing glasses, Clara upstairs reading. Looking around, I realized this was exactly what I'd been moving towards since that first "don't come for Christmas" email. Not payback, not proving a point, just this peace, chosen and protected. The empty stocking stayed on the mantel, but it didn't feel empty anymore. It felt like a reminder that sometimes the best gift you can give yourself is the space to fill life with the right people. And this year, every seat in that room had been filled exactly how it should be. When I look back now, I don't think about the fights, the emails, or the silences. I think about the people who showed up without conditions, the laughter around the table, and the moments that didn't need an explanation. Family isn't about shared blood, it's about shared respect. And once you learn to stop chasing the wrong doors, you realize the right ones were open the whole time.